The UK's costly net zero plan is under fire, and Ed Miliband's leadership isn't helping. In a heated committee session, MP Christopher Chope grilled him, but Miliband struggled to respond. Watch the tense exchange.
Secretary of State, in your 2008 Act,
yes,
you put a lot of emphasis on the need for adaptation and for building resilience measures. You haven't mentioned that in your opening remarks, and you will know that the Climate Change Committee is extremely critical of the lack of progress on that front. And bearing in mind that the Environmental Audit Agency, the Environment Agency, said in December that they were expecting by 2050 that 1 in 4 properties in England would be vulnerable to flooding. What are you doing to ensure that the government invests sufficiently in flood defences?
Well, look, Sir Christopher, I know from reading the testimony of Emma Pinchbeck to your committee that this is something you've taken an interest in, and I think we should just be frank about this, that this has for too long been somewhat of an orphan in government. I mean, it's led, as you will know, and indeed I think you expressed some concern about this. It's led not by my department but by DEFRA, working with the Cabinet Office. But look, I can certainly agree with you at a general level that as we think about the effects of the climate crisis already in the system, if you like, this is something which needs much greater focus from government. I think we should be frank also that this is something which requires significant levels of investment at a time when the public finances, as you know, are incredibly tight. But this is a really, really important project, and I think it's something the government needs. And I'm happy to play my part in this. Something that the government needs to give proper attention to, because I don't think it's had the attention it deserves in the past.
So, if the government was to decide that investing in adaptation and resilience measures should take priority over some of the capital programmes in your budget, you would go along with that, would you, on the basis that adaptation and resilience are of much greater significance for the ordinary people, you described the working people, than issues around reducing CO2 emissions? Because since 1990, we've reduced our CO2 emissions by half, but it hasn't made a ha'porth of difference to the impact of climate change on ordinary people in this country. So we've got surely to put our priority in adaptation and resilience measures.
I think you're going to be frustrated with my answer, Sir Christopher. I mean, I think we've got to do both. Because, look, we could give up on measures on tackling greenhouse gas emissions, but I think that would be grossly irresponsible, because the way I think about this is obviously Britain on its own can't tackle the climate crisis. You're absolutely right to say that. We're 1% of global emissions. But the decisions we make have a massive effect on our ability to influence others to also act. And let me just give you a very clear example of this. When we passed the 2008 Climate Change Act, it was emulated around the world. So it didn't just have an effect in Britain, it had an effect elsewhere. I think there's something like 25 other equivalents of the Climate Change Committee in different countries of the world. If we achieve clean power by 2030 as the mission of our government, it will send a message to the rest of the world about what is possible. So it's a frustrating answer to you, but I don't think there's any other option, and I don't think there's any other responsible option other than doing both of these things.
But you're ducking the question about adaptation and resilience, because we used to be global leaders in adaptation and resilience, and the Climate Change Committee says that we have fallen behind on that. And you are not prepared to, it seems, to say publicly that you believe that adaptation and building resilience is and should be a top priority, because back in 1953, as you will recall, in
wasn't around in 1953. Not suggesting you were actually.
In the Netherlands, there were 2,000 people killed as a result of flooding. We've got similar problems now in the United States, masses of people being killed as a result of the consequences of climate change. Are you really going to stand there and say that this government is going to ignore the priorities which have been identified by the Environment Agency, and the need to prevent 1 in 4 households, it's about 8 million people, being vulnerable to flooding by 2050, whatever happens.
Absolutely not, Sir Christopher. And you and I, and if my answer wasn't clear to you, you and I share absolutely a commitment that we need to act, and this government has a commitment to act on flood defences and all of the issues that you say. But so there we agree. But if you want to then suggest to me that we should throw under the bus the idea that we should tackle greenhouse gas emissions as the price of that, that's where I'm going to part company with you.
I'm not suggesting that, but what I am suggesting is that you should be willing, as a member of the government, to insist that greater priority should be given to investment in adaptation and resilience, even if it means having to cut back on some of your own ambitions in your own department.
I don't think that would be a responsible course of action, Sir Christopher. And I think you are posing a false choice. And I think if we say to the British people, just to step outside this committee for a minute, if we say to the British people, should we tackle the threat of climate change that it's going to pose to people's way of life, they'd say absolutely. But if we also said to them, in adapting to that threat, we're going to not do anything about the threat growing bigger and bigger, i.e. therefore making the need for adaptation more and more expensive, they'd say, well, that can't be right. I mean, that's the whole point here, which is, and this is, if you like, the starting point for much of our discussions. The key insight of Nick Stern in the 2000s, the Stern report, was the costs of not acting on climate change are greater than the costs of acting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.